This is the last week of our 5-week study in the book of Genesis, where we have gone back to the future. We started in Genesis 1, and we've now tracked all the way through to the story last week of Abraham and Isaac. We're not going to get through the rest of the book, all right? So sorry to let you down. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 25 this morning, and I've titled our sermon, On His Heels. On His Heels. So go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 25. And we'll read that in just a minute. But I have a question. How many of you have ever felt like you just don't measure up? Like you didn't make the cut, you just weren't good enough. In 6th grade, that was the first time that as students at this elementary school that we were able to try out for a musical instrument, musical team, whatever. And to this point, we've had music classes. We've learned how to sing and kind of learned how to read music. We learned how to play the recorder. But this was the real deal. Real instruments, real practices, real concerts, really excited parents, even though their ears would never be the same. And so I decided I was going to try out and play the drums. My parents quickly said, no, you're not doing that. So the next best option, at least in my mind, was the handbells. I don't know why, but I was like, well, I'll play the handbells. And so the music teacher holds a open tryout, and when I show up, it had nothing to do with how well you could ring the bells, but rather how well you knew music. And so we had a 10-question quiz, and I think I got 2 of them right. I'm pretty sure one of them was because I put my name in the right spot. I didn't make the handbell chorus. And it was tragic. I was really upset. I didn't measure up. I didn't make the cut, and it hurt. It made me angry. I was mad at the music teacher. Like, well, why don't you just teach me how to read music? Then I could actually play the handbells. Like, just help me out here. I was one of 4 kids that instead got 2 extra recesses throughout the week. And that sounds really good, but recess without your friends isn't very much fun. And so I was embarrassed by this. I was embarrassed that I was one of 4 kids not to be playing a musical instrument and the other 3 didn't try out. I mean, it was heartbreaking. And I'll be honest, I decided because I wasn't good enough, I was going to quit music altogether. Can you relate to me on this? Maybe not in music, but what about in academics? Or in sports? Or a job? Or maybe even a group of people that you wanted to be friends with, but you just weren't good enough. You didn't measure up. But let me ask you a different question. Have you ever felt that way with God? Have you ever felt like you've let God down one too many times? Have you ever felt that you realize you just don't measure up to the person that God wants you to be? You see, God's Old Testament people, the nation of Israel, certainly felt this way at times. I mean, these people were a people chosen by God, and yet they continued to chase after fake gods. They continued to pursue worldly pleasures. They were constantly plagued with battles because their enemies were stronger than them. And so this morning, we're going to look at a story given to a people feeling defeated. But as they receive this story, they and we are reminded of a gracious God who has called his people to be victorious. So let's begin reading here in Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 19. This is the account of the family of Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. But the 2 children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to the Lord and asked about it. "What is happening to me?" she asked. And the Lord told her, "The sons in your womb will become 2 nations. From the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son." And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat. So they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. I want to look at this story this morning in actually two sections. So this is section 1. We'll call it Act 1. And in Act 1, we find promise. So what's going on in our text this morning is that it's a new chapter unfolding in God's plan to redeem the world through the nation of Israel. And so we're going to read about Isaac and his sons, but before we even get there, the author takes time to remind us that Isaac is the son of Abraham. He does this because the author wants us to remember the faithfulness of God. You see, Abraham was promised by God that he would become a great nation, but he was an old man and his wife was barren. They had no children, and yet God, in his faithfulness, provided a kid to this old man and this barren woman. But then we are also reminded of God's faithfulness again because Isaac is still alive. Last week we looked at the fact that God provided a ram so that Isaac could live. And so now Isaac is a grown man. He's married to a woman named Rebekah. And unfortunately, barrenness runs in the family. It's kind of an oxymoron, right? But with God, he just keeps providing. Like, these women can't have babies, and then all of a sudden they're having babies. It's a miracle. It's God's providence, God's graciousness in their life. And so for 20 years, Rebekah has not been able to have any children. In fact, her mother-in-law, Sarah, who also was barren, waited 25 years. And this 25-year span covered 9 chapters of Genesis. But here we find that the barrenness is resolved in but one verse. However, we can pretty much read into verse 21 all of the anxiety, all of the concern, all of the uncertainty that Sarah was facing throughout 9 chapters, and we can read that into Rebekah's life in verse 21. Because God had promised a huge family, but there was yet another roadblock. They weren't having children. And then enter Isaac on stage, and he comes, and by faith he prays to God. And he says, God, my wife is barren. Would you please provide for us? Right? Jehovah Jireh. We talked about that last week. God, can you please provide? And sure enough, God delivers. And Rebekah carries twins. And then in verse 24, we are going to read that she's going to have twins. But before we get there, we find that even though Rebekah is pregnant, she's not overjoyed. Instead of throwing baby showers, she's instead in complete agony. Instead of throwing a gender reveal party, she's in excruciating pain. It says in verse 22 that these boys were struggling inside of her. It could actually be translated, the Hebrew word there is very strong. It could be translated, and the boys were smashing together inside of her. Like, this is a full-fledged war. Parents, you think your kids misbehaving was bad and like beating the snot out of each other. It wasn't her living room walls she was worried about. It was like the walls of her belly. And the boys are just smashing them up. This was terrible. She was in so much pain that she despaired of even living. And so finally she decides to go to God and be like, God, what's going on? What are you doing? What is this? And God responds, and notice what he says in verse 23. And the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become 2 nations. From the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. You see, we find the first promise here, and it's that there's going to be a family feud. She goes and inquires of the Lord, and God responds in what we would call an oracle, or it's another word for a promise. And he gives it in what's called synthetic parallelism. What it means is there's 2 lines. The first line tells you something. The second line gives more details about the first line. And so God says, okay, you want to know what's going on inside of you? Inside of your belly is twins. And they're going to be 2 nations. Oh, that's great. Like 2 nations? Like not just one, now 2. But wait for line number 2. The nations are going to be enemies. They're going to be rivals. There's going to be family feud. There's going to be conflict. And then the second promise we find here is that there's going to be a role reversal. Not only would these two brothers birth two different nations, because these nations will be enemies, that means that one would prevail over the other. But it wouldn't be the older over the younger. It was going to be a role reversal. The younger would rule over the older. At this time, this is revolutionary. This didn't happen in the ancient Near East. The older brother was always born with certain natural rights that weren't to be questioned. But enter God, and we find that the opposite is true. That the younger would be the son of prominence. And this can only happen because of a sovereign God who's in control. But this promise, this oracle, is going to bring about conflict. So then we come to verse 24, and sure enough, Rebekah has twins. And so the first child is born, and it says that he is red and covered in hair. And then the second comes out, and he's like holding on to his heel, and so the second one is born. Now, if we have all been influenced by Western cowboy movies, we would think the firstborn was like the hero, right? Like he's the cowboy that is like, he's tan, he can grow a man's beard, like he is a man's man. He's like a sharpshooter, he's out in the wilderness, he's the great guy. He's a cowboy that's going to save the whole town. And on the flip side, you have Jacob, sly, clean cut, deceitful, mama's boy. He's kind of like the town mayor who swindles everything out of everyone. But our assumption would be wrong. Because in fact, Esau is Edom, Israel's arch enemy. I want to share with you a little bit of Hebrew history. Because you see, this story will continue, and eventually Israel will be captured by and oppressed by Egypt. And then God will deliver the Israelites out of Egypt and to the promised land. Remember the promise that was made to Abraham about Canaan. And so as they're delivered from Egypt and they're working their way towards the promised land, there's a direct route from where they stand to where they're going. But guess who inhabits it? The Edomites. It's the nation of Edom. And so what happens is Moses sends some messengers and politely asks that the king give them safe travels through. Notice what it says here in Numbers chapter 20, starting in verse 14 and following. While Moses was at Kadesh, he sent ambassadors to the king of Edom with this message. This is what your relatives, the people of Israel, say. You know of the hardships we have been through. Our ancestors went down to Egypt and we lived there a long time. And we and our ancestors were brutally mistreated by the Egyptians. But when we cried out to the Lord, he heard us and sent an angel who brought us out of Egypt. Now we camp at Kadesh, and a town on the border of your land. Please let us travel through your land. We'll be careful not to go through your fields and vineyards. We won't even drink from your wells. We'll stay on the king's road and never leave it until we have passed through your territory. But the king of Edom said, stay out of my land, or I will meet you with an army. So Moses requests safe passage through Edom, and the king says, no, don't you dare, or we are going to come at you with the sword. But this conflict is going to continue even to the time that King David is now the king of Israel. And again, there's constant war and conflict with Israel and their enemies. And at one point, David in battle kills 18,000 Edomites and takes the rest of Edom captive. And they serve in the nation of Israel. But eventually they would regain their independence, and they would side with the Babylonians as the Babylonians capture the Israel people and send them into exile. And then finally, if you recall in the New Testament, when Jesus was born, there was a guy named Herod who was killing all babies 2 years and under because he found out that the Messiah, Jesus, was born. And even Herod himself was an Edomite. You see, this conflict between Israel and Edom keeps on continuing. Why do I share this with you? Well, I share it with you because that's how Israel would have understood the name Edom or Esau, with hostility. So they would automatically realize that this author has nothing good to say about this baby boy Esau. This is not a Western cowboy movie, it's the ancient Near East. In those days, there was a prejudice against those with this red complexion. Furthermore, hairiness or shagginess was a mark of the uncivilized. So Esau is not the cowboy that's going to save the town. In fact, he's not even portrayed as an ordinary baby. Instead, he's portrayed more as a beast of the field. And then you find Jacob. And there's this description about Jacob, and it has nothing to do with his appearance, but rather his action. This child is a heel grabber. In the womb, Jacob is already a ruthless fighter, at, smashing against his mother's belly with his older brother. And now at birth, he holds on to the heel of his brother. He's trying to catch up with his older brother. And this is going to be a pattern that sets the rest of the story. So let's continue reading here in verse 27. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home. But Rebekah loved Jacob. One day when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness, exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, "I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew." This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. "All right," Jacob replied, "but trade me your right as the firstborn son." "Look, I'm dying of starvation," said Esau. "What good is this birthright to me now?" But Jacob said, "First you must swear that your birthright is mine." So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all of his rights as a firstborn to his brother Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. We come to the second act which we'll call fulfillment. And understand, we already know that Jacob is going to be the covenant heir. Jacob will eventually become Israel. That's going to be the change of his name. But we can't afford to let this knowledge allow us to leap ahead in the narrative. So just track with me through this as if it's unfolding right here in front of you. Because in Act 1, there was a promise, but to this point, we haven't seen any fulfillment of that promise until now. There hasn't been any massive family feuds. There hasn't been any role reversals up until this point. But then we start reading, and it's talking about these people. And Jacob, it says, had a quiet temperament. This is really important to the story because Jacob, having a quiet temperament, the Hebrew word there is the same word, blameless. The same word that was given to Noah, used to describe Noah and why God spared his life and his family with the flood. This word blameless was used to describe Abraham. But Jacob? Like how can Jacob be called blameless? This doesn't make sense, but that's how he's portrayed. And so we begin seeing these fulfillments. The first fulfillment is that the family feud grows out of family favorites. You see, as we're reading along, it says that Isaac, dad, loved Esau. Why did he love him? Because he liked to eat wild game. He liked venison that Esau would bring home. And he's like, "Cool, you're my favorite son. You bring home the good food." And then you have Jacob, who his mom prefers him. Why? Because he's a mama's boy. He's at her side all the time. Of course she's going to love him more. And understand that this love is not like, "Oh, I love you and I hate the other." It's just, I have preference for you. I prefer you to the other. And this story isn't about parenting. While there's certainly some advice that could be made as to not showing favorites, the reason the author emphasizes this favoritism is because this favoritism is going to energize the conflict between the two brothers. There's this family feud going on, and it's being fueled by the favoritism being shown. But then the second fulfillment, the role reversal, is fulfilled through a robbed reality. A robbed reality. That means that this role reversal is going to become a reality through robbery, not through God's working or doing. So the drama continues to unfold, and we catch our first glimpse of the family feud, and then we see that context, and then one day, in comes Esau. He's been out hunting all day. He's exhausted. It was hard work, hiked all over the place, and he comes in and he's like, who but Jacob is staying there making some food? And he sees him and he's just like, dude, I am so hungry. Like literally, I am going to die. Give me some of that red soup. And Jacob keenly thinks and says, all right, but first, you give me your birthright. And so it's important that we understand this birthright thing because that's not common to us. But a birthright in that day and age was a father, when he had sons, would take all of his inheritance and divide it equally among all the brothers, except there would be an extra one. So if he had 10 children, 10 boys, he would divide it into 11 equal shares. The first child would get 2, and the other 9 boys would each get 1. So it would be a double portion of the inheritance. So imagine being the second-born brother, like this would be pretty annoying. Like, oh man, I was right behind him, and he gets 2, and I only get 1. But then imagine if you were a twin, how much more frustrating that would be. Like, he was literally right on his heels, but yet his brother gets this double portion. So Jacob tells him, yeah, but first you give me this birthright. The demand is actually stated in such a way that shows that it's premeditated. Jacob has long planned to exploit his brother's weakness. Jacob, the heel grabber, has been waiting for an opportunity, and finally he sees it. And so he says, yeah, just give me your birthright. And Esau, starving to death, thinks, oh, what good is a birthright if I'm dead? It does me absolutely no good. So sure, go ahead, have it. It's all yours. But Jacob isn't content just to have a verbal agreement because verbal agreements could be reneged on, right? It's kind of like this little emoji guy with that ridiculous smile and like fingers crossed. This was me when I was growing up and I had a younger brother. I'd be like, here's the deal, Nathan. If you go and you get me some snacks and refill my iced tea, then I'll let you play the video game for a little bit. Yep, and then he comes back, he gives me the stuff, and I'm like, sorry, my fingers were crossed. Have fun watching me play. And so Jacob is going to have none of this. He's like, look, here's the deal. If you want this soup, then you have to enter into a legally binding agreement. And so they make this oath. And with that, Jacob steals his brother's birthright, and he surpasses his brother. He becomes the legal firstborn of the family. And what's interesting is this story never overtly condemns Jacob's actions, at least here. But later, we're going to see that God was not okay with how Jacob did this. You see, when it talks about the life of Abraham, the life of Isaac, they lived these lives that are described as being old and full of days. But when Jacob has an encounter with Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 49, it says that he describes his life as being hard, and it was few. His life doesn't even compare to that of his ancestors. God didn't approve of the way he finagled this whole situation to rob his brother's birthright. It's a tragic ending for Esau because in 4 very quick verbs, he gets his moment of self-indulgence and then he disappears from the stage. But what's very interesting is the narrator is going to actually give an assessment of what just happened. He can't dismiss it without commenting on what just happened. And it says that Esau despised his birthright. This is fascinating because Hebrew authors almost never assess somebody's decisions like this. Like they state things matter-of-factly. They don't give a value judgment as to what just happened. But the author did. He says that Esau despised his birthright. That means he treated it as worthless. He held it in contempt. So what is going on? The author's point is clear. Esau is not spiritually fit to be the child of promise. Esau is a slave to the moment. The story proves that Esau is not worthy. Instead, Jacob is the promised heir. Jacob is the one that's called blameless. But if we were just following the story, Jacob is not worthy either. And he's certainly not blameless. This heel grabber refused to wait for God's timing to fulfill this promise. He stole his brother's birthright. He selfishly plotted to get what he wanted, and he was willing to destroy anyone in his way. In fact, later we're going to read that Jacob then deceives his own father. His father who's old and blind, and he comes in and he steals a blessing that was intended for Esau, and now he stole that from him too. Then even still later, Jacob is going to work for his uncle Laban, and he's going to deceive his uncle Laban to line his own pockets, to fill his own bank account. And then finally, Jacob is actually going to wrestle with God himself. And God is going to beat him in this wrestling match, but Jacob is going to grab a hold of him and refuse to let go until God himself blesses Jacob. Jacob is by no means blameless. He's a heel grabber. He's a deceiver. He's a self-made man. But yet he's called blameless? How can this be? He's not blameless because of his own character. He's blameless because of the character of God. You see, the story proves that Jacob is not worthy to be the seed of the woman. But still, Jacob is the seed of the woman. The point is this, that God's choice is totally and only by God's grace. So the big idea for us this morning is this: kick the crutch of failure and lean on a gracious God. Kick the crutch of failure and lean on a gracious God. My failure at music led me to believe that I wasn't good enough. I didn't measure up. And I quit music. I despised it altogether. But then finally, my senior year of high school, some friends convinced me to join the senior high choir. Because they were joining it, they're like, it'll be fun. I didn't want another study hall, so I joined. And then I was like, well, I guess this whole music thing isn't so bad. So then I was in college, and I decided, I guess I can tolerate music enough to buy a used iPod. And so I bought a used iPod. And then this past December, I actually, for the first time, have started to learn to play an instrument. I can't play it yet, so don't fear, but I'm working on it, all right? But for the longest time, not being good enough was a crutch in my life. It was a crutch for me musically, but how many of us have used this same excuse as a reason not to be used by God? I've made too many mistakes. I just keep struggling with that. I'm not good enough. Etc., etc., etc. The story this morning reminds us that God is a gracious God. It reminds us that God works contrary to human assumptions. You see, God chose the younger, the lesser, to be victorious, even when he was a self-made heel grabber. Through the entire Bible, we see God choosing the younger over the older. He chose Abel over Cain. He chose Isaac over Ishmael. He chose Jacob over Esau. He chose Joseph over his 11 brothers. He chose Ephraim over Manasseh. He chose David over his brothers, Solomon over Adonijah. The same story continues into the New Testament when God chooses Jesus Christ to be the seed of the woman. Because by all human assumptions and customs, Jesus was not worthy. He was born in a stable. He was from despised Nazareth. He was poor and lowly. And yet God used Jesus Christ to accomplish the work of salvation. The seed of the woman, the Messiah from Israel. And then at the end of his earthly ministry, Jesus chooses pathetic disciples to take forward his gospel, to change the world, to advance his kingdom. But this shouldn't surprise us because all throughout his life, Jesus reminds us of what his kingdom is like. Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first. Jesus says the greatest now will be the least in my kingdom, and the least now will be the greatest in my kingdom. The point is this: relationship with God was only, is only, and will forever only be by God's grace. We don't measure up, but that is precisely the point. Because Jesus measured up on our behalf. You see, if we were not good enough to work for our salvation, then we can't be bad enough and work our way out of our salvation. We can't work for God's grace, and we can't work to lose God's grace. So stop telling yourself that you can't be used by God because you don't measure up. Quit using your failures as a crutch and an excuse not to spend time with the God who died for you. Because the truth of the matter is that these things are lies from Satan to keep you from doing God's kingdom work. Christian, this morning I want you to know you can't let down a God that you were never holding up. But you know what God tells us in the book of Isaiah? Isaiah 41 says this: "Don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you." And then notice this: "I hold you up with my victorious right hand." Enough excuses. Kick the crutch of failure and lean on a gracious God. Let's pray. Lord God, I thank you so much for all that you do for us. God, I thank you that you choose to work even in spite of us, even in spite of our sins and our shortcomings. God, you are a gracious God, and we rejoice in that. So God, teach us to stop using these as excuses and start serving you, start loving you more, start spending time with you, start sharing you with other people. God, we thank you for this reminder this morning. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.